and welcome to Captive Minds. Before I begin, I'm just going to credit the song for the opening montage is Every Day is Halloween by Ministry. And at the end of this episode, there will be another montage again, and the song at that time will be Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus. Anyways, I'm Shaenah Batterson, a writer with a Substack called The Red Letter, and to shamelessly promote myself, I just had another piece recently published in Covert Action magazine about George Orwell. With me, as always, is my co-host Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hey, Shaenah. Good to be back and for a Halloween special. So, yeah, should be good.
Yes, Max is an independent journalist who is currently syndicated with Cam, and today we thought it would be fun to honor the spooky season and do a special Halloween episode. I'm even dressed for the occasion. I'm the specter of Bolshevism haunting the West. And anyways, we'll start off with vampires and maybe get into Frankenstein a little bit. And Stanley Kubrick's film, The Shining. Let's begin with vampires. They're very ubiquitous in popular culture and seem to hold powerful sway over the collective imagination. And on a symbolic level, I think vampires can represent multiple things. The first, I would say, I guess the most obvious one is that vampires represent the power of blood, because blood sacrifice and blood drinking has occurred throughout human history. And even a notable example of symbolic blood drinking is Christian communion, being that the wine represents the blood of Christ. The second sort of theme with vampires, I would say, is sexuality and sexual repression, which really came to the fore in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula film from 1992. In the film, Dracula provides a release for Mina Harker and her friend Lucy's sexuality, which has been repressed by the stultifying Victorian Anglican culture of that time. And not only is Dracula highly sexual, he is foreign and exotic, carrying a sensuousness of the East, so to speak. Though I would say the most important symbolic meaning of the vampire is the economic one. The vampire is a capitalist. This even this even figures in Bram Stoker's book Dracula, which can be read as the aristocracy's reaction of horror at the rising bourgeoisie. In the book, Dracula is an investor who's buying up properties in London, shipping mysterious coffins of dirt to his various locations. Like a capitalist, the vampire feeds, enriching itself, on the blood of others, keeping them alive yet depriving them of their vitality. I mean, Marx didn't hesitate to use the vampire metaphor in his magnum opus, Capital. He repeatedly refers to vampires and blood-sucking, the capitalist draining the blood of the worker, and other such descriptions. For example, quote, capital is dead labor, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks, close quote. So the vampire, in a sense, too, because capital itself is sort of this undead thing that keeps perpetuating itself and sucking off of others, similar to a vampire. But however, the vampire metaphor has also historically been co-opted by reactionary forces. For example, I included two images in the montage, two propaganda posters for Nazi Germany of the Bolsheviks as a vampire and Stalin as a vampire. So, Max, can you tell us a little bit about the original Nosferatu and how the vampire was used in Nazi propaganda?
Well, yeah, well, first of all, I think that even the themes of sexual repression in Victorian England are even present in the Bram Stoker novel, though obviously not as explicitly as in the Hollywood Coppola film, but it's present there as well. There's a number of ways to interpret both the novel and the various adaptations that have been done, including the F.W. Murnau classic film, which is over 100 years old now, came out in 1922. But yeah, it said, I mean, it was a German film, and it said that it did have, some of the imagery that's in it did have an influence on Nazi propaganda. Obviously, that wasn't really intended. I mean, Murnau, as I understand, was actually a openly gay man and did not have a personal history of prejudice or anti-Semitism at all. I mean, the screenwriter of the Murnau film was also Jewish, as I understand, and I think was even persecuted by the Nazis. But there was arguably a connection in terms of not just its the imagery, the characteristics of the blood-sucking vampire in the film, but also the content as well, as far as what you were saying about the whole nature of vampires. And historically, it was released at a time where the seeds of fascism were starting to grow in Germany. Like I said, it was released in 1922 after the end of World War One. And of course, Weimar Germany was in the midst of a decade-long post-war political and economic crisis, which reached a crescendo with the Great Depression at the end of the decade. But, after the war, the Kaiser had abdicated the throne. There'd been a failed revolution attempt, which we've discussed before on the podcast previously, where Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were notoriously murdered in the Spartacus uprising. And even though that revolution failed, there was a change politically. The monarchy was overthrown, and even though Germany was, at least on the surface, ostensibly a democracy, there was this growing threat from the extreme right, which launched multiple coup attempts. Uh, and like I said, by the end of the decade, you had the Great Depression, which just plunged Germany even further into hyperinflation and economic crisis. And of course, the Nazis eventually came to power. But so that's the political climate that the Murnau film came out in, where there was this humiliating defeat of Germany in the First World War and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which placed the blame for the war on Germany or held it responsible. Um, and that treaty was obviously infamously hated by the right, who saw it as national humiliation. And with those ingredients came the need for, a scapegoat. And of course, anti-Semitism started to rear its ugly head. Actually, it's not horror, but a great film that really captures what Weimar Germany was like is Fassbinder's Berlin Alexanderplatz, which is if people are interested, it's a 19-hour miniseries and was based on a novel by Alfred Doblin, if I'm saying his name correctly. But it really captures like the poverty, the crime and rampant crime and alienation of living in this, modern industrial capitalist metropolis like 1920s Berlin. And it has, it just depicts these characters, one of whom is an ex-con, just surrounded by this political and societal upheaval and that it's backdrop by. And it's an extraordinary film if you have time for it, but it is very long. But anyway, back to horror and Nosferatu. Oh, well, first of all, it's not the first adaptation for the screen, I don't think, of Bram Stoker's novel. But Nosferatu by Murnau was actually the first, at least the first major adaptation. And Dracula with Bela Lugosi, that came out, I think, in the 30s. It was later. But Nosferatu notably was also an unofficial or unauthorized version. The film was actually controversial upon its release, despite its success, in part because of the lawsuit brought by Bram Stoker's widow. It changed the main character names to Count Orlok, which, by the way, the Robert Eggers film, which came out last year, which is worth seeing, uh, kept that and also altered the setting. The Renault film also altered the setting to fictional city of Wisborg, I think it's called. And also they added characteristics to the vampires that were not in the book, I don't believe, like sunlight being fatal. But its plot, nevertheless, was still based on the Bram Stoker book. And even in the book, now it's very difficult to have this discussion in our, like you were asking about you were asking me to talk about the anti-Semitism. Well, it's difficult to have this conversation, obviously, in the current context of our own historical time period, because you have this genocide in Gaza going on, and you have Zionists creating this moral panic and public hysteria about anti-Semitism. I mean, just look at the fear mongering related to this New York City mayoral race. But regardless, anti-Semitism, despite the exploitation of it by Zionists, is a real historical phenomenon, and or Judeophobia, especially in Europe historically, and in literature and other cultural mediums, the myth of vampirism from folklore going back hundreds of years has always been laden with, or latent with anti-Semitic tropes, let's say. I mean, which, it plays on anxieties about the other, and also the accusation of blood libel against Jews, which is this, age-old canard about, going back to medieval times about, or I'm sorry, medieval Europe and the spread of Christianity, that Jews ritualistically killed Christians by sucking their blood and whatnot. And so the original novel, Dracula, had a premise and imagery that you could say toyed with that, and where, the first of all, Count Dracula is presented as an Eastern European immigrant from Transylvania who arrives in London to spread the curse of vampirism. So there's also the presence of anxieties about immigration, not to mention, like what you were saying about the repression of sexuality in the Victorian era. Dracula seduces two of the female protagonists in the story. But actually, there's a debate about the inspiration for the Dracula character. Some sources say it was Elizabeth Bathory, others say it was Vlad the Impaler, but scholars actually seem to have settled on Henry Irving as one of the direct inspirations for Bram Stoker. Who, if you're not familiar, Henry Irving was a English stage actor in the Victorian era, and Bram Stoker, I guess, had worked as his business manager for several years. And Irving was famous for actually playing the character of Shylock in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which is, of course, the Shylock character was this vindictive and stereotypically greedy Jewish character, albeit there was some humanity given to the character by Shakespeare in that play. And it's debated however much it was really anti-Semitic, but nonetheless, it's widely considered a anti-Semitic stereotype. So Henry Irving was famous for playing that role on the stage and was a major inspiration for Dracula in terms of his physical appearance and his personality. Though apparently Irving's portrayal of Shylock was a much more sympathetic one than the traditional villainous interpretation of the role given by other actors prior to him. But Irving, in addition to his physical features, was known, I guess he was known as a very arrogant and charismatic performer who like just mesmerized audiences with these dark and dramatic performances. And so I guess his relationship with Bram Stoker influenced, how he formulated the Count Dracula character. But, there was also, even with not just the Murnau film, but with the Bram Stoker novel, there was also accusations of anti-Semitic undertones, because of, I guess there's a particular line where Jonathan Harker, who's the solicitor lawyer character who goes to Transylvania to meet with Count Dracula about his desire to move to London and acquire property. I guess there's a part where he goes to a chapel, and a workman in the chapel, I guess, describes the building as having the smell of old Jerusalem. So some scholars have argued that even the book had anti-Semitic undertones, and that Dracula embodied stereotypes at the time. I think it's safe to say that the novel was, Yeah, I mean, there's people that argue that it was expressing Victorian England's fear of immigrants, invading from the East. Obviously, works of art are products of their time, and there's probably some truth to that, I think. And the same goes for Murnau's film. Although it made a number of changes, it also seemingly reflected also it really incorporated or emphasized, the fear of disease. I mean, the Robert Eggers film really does the same thing because, the Murnau was released right after the Spanish flu, the influenza pandemic, but I think both the book and the film, reflect the cultural zeitgeist of their respective periods of release. I mean, I think the Bram Stoker novel was released in 1897 and the Murnau film 1922. I mean, all works of art reflect their time period to one extent or another. And actually, Nosferatu as a German expressionist film arguably leaned into those sort of figurative motifs even more than the novel, like I was saying about the spread of disease. So it wasn't just like reflecting a fear of immigration, but also, one of the main tropes of anti-Semitism has always been that Jews, and not just Jews, but immigrants are responsible for spreading a disease, and that outsiders come in and spread contagion and so on. So the Nazis obviously had similar ideas that, about the blood of the German nation being poisoned by others or being tainted with impurity and uncleanliness and so on. So obviously with the depiction of Nosferatu in that film, who's played by Max Schreck, his physical characteristics with the large nose, the big bushy eyebrows, whether it was intended or not, like I was saying, F.W. Murnau was friendly with Jews his whole life and not an anti-Semite, and he was openly gay. And the screenwriter of the film, Henrik Galeen, I believe his name was also Jewish and even persecuted by the Nazis. But regardless of the intent behind it, it really ended up sort of lending itself to misinterpretation or those kind of connotations. And with the film's success, the Nazis adopted some of the imagery for their own purposes and their propaganda and found it useful as a source of inspiration, where they used similar imagery. I guess the Nazi propagandist Julius Streicher, most infamously, was fond of the film. And by the way, the Robert Eggers film is worth seeing. It's not necessarily outstanding in my opinion, but to its credit, it did try to stay true to those themes, even with the disease element, like making a commentary about COVID. I mean, I don't want to get into a big debate about COVID, but it was definitely like trying to stay true to the central themes of the Murnau film. But yeah, so long story short, there's a lot of historians and scholars that say that it did have an impact being released in Germany. That the Nazis adopted its characteristics for their own purposes.
That's interesting what you're saying about Henry Irving as the inspiration for Dracula. I didn't know that. And yeah, that I know that talked about this on a previous episode, but the Nazis they portrayed Jews, and Slavs as in their propaganda as vampires. But conversely, the good Germans and specifically like the Waffen SS and whatnot were portrayed as werewolves because for some reason werewolves were the good monsters that would fight the vampires. I haven't looked into it enough to know really why the werewolves were the good kind of monsters. Unclear on that. Another well-known literary monster I want to talk a little bit about is Frankenstein. There are multiple interpretations of Mary Shelley's book, one of which I'd say is that it's a critique of modernity and the belief in scientific progress. I don't, I haven't read the book myself, so I don't know enough to say, but do you want to talk a little bit about Frankenstein?
Yeah, well, speaking of which, there's actually a new Guillermo del Toro directed film of Frankenstein that's out. I mean, it's been depicted countless times. But there is, so this is kind of topical. There is another film out in theaters, I guess, and Guillermo del Toro's made some interesting films. I mean, some I'm not so fond of, but he's done some films that address themes of fascism, and he did a Pinocchio adaptation. He's done a number of interesting films. So that's out in theaters. But in regard to Frankenstein, I mean, I think that the interpretation that it's a parable about modernity, warning of the dangers of unchecked scientific progress and innovation and technological development, having this cautionary tale about it of unforeseen and destructive consequences, that's even become so ubiquitous. It's as a metaphor. We always say they've created a monster, and that's the consensus interpretation, and that is there. I don't mean to say that that's not present in the subtext, but I do think it's sort of an oversimplistic reading to some extent, because yes, obviously the story on the surface does serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of science and technology spinning out of control, and addresses obvious also the many ethical questions about the moral responsibility of playing with nature, and the created messing with creating. The it's definitely a exploration of like the deeper implications of scientific advancement and the potential dangers, no doubt. And obviously, like that aspect of the book has become probably even more relevant than at the time it was released, when you consider stuff now like genetic engineering or cloning or whatever. So clearly there are parables with the Frankenstein story, and that's one reading of the book. But I think there is also a social critique in it that is often missed, that does not get as much attention in Frankenstein. And it's placed in the literary canon, so to speak, leads has led it to have many interpretations. I mean, I don't know whether you can say one or the other is correct, but ultimately I believe that I personally think that the text has a critique of capitalism as an economic system, with the social ills and contradictions it produces, not just crime and social hierarchy, but inequality. If you read the book and you look at the central characters and plot, because first of all, I don't know too much about it, but I do know that Mary Shelley's parents were both radicals. Her mother was a feminist way before, a pioneer. I mean, she wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And so that's led many feminist scholars to have their own reinterpretation of the narrative.
Yeah, I have.
Especially since, Frankenstein, first of all, is trying to create a creature that it doesn't need to have reproductive power or the need for women to bear children. So that in and of itself, leads one to have could lead one to have that kind of interpretation of the book. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say I had read that some people interpreted the book as a critique of the bourgeois family, especially the sort of how families were in the Victorian era.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's there. And the fact that Dr. Frankenstein is trying to remove the one, well, or one, especially at the time, one of the main sources of, I don't know what you would say, call it social value for women or social power for women, the reproductive power. Here's this mad scientist trying to effectively remove that with, but about Mary Shelley, back to her, her father was also an anarchist philosopher and a novelist. So my point is that even though these influences are seldom mentioned, but biographically, I think it had an impact on her writing, because from a very young age, she was exposed to anti-establishment and socialist, radical anarchist ideas. And actually, another, speaking of the feminist angle, another angle is the fact that a lot of people have tried to say that she didn't really write the book, that the poet, she was in a relationship with the poet Percy Shelley, who I think he was married, and so it was an affair, and a lot of people have tried to say that he really wrote it, which is arguably, a sexist dismissal of her talents. And also there's this, growing up, I always heard this, there's this legend about the way that it was composed. There's a myth surrounding it that they one night on like a really rainy evening, she was at a villa with Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, and that they all like collectively dared one another to come up with ghost stories or horror stories. And there's this whole myth that it was like written in one night, which is not true. I think that it was actually written over a period of a year. I mean, she labored and came up with the idea of Frankenstein, but it is true that the original idea for it was like that it wasn't written in one night, but there was this evening where the three of them, I guess, dared one another to come up with a story, and that's how the genesis of it came about. But if you read the book, there's a lot of social criticism in it. It's not just a parable about modernity and technology and science. Starting with the social critique is definitely starts right away with the contrast between the Frankenstein and the DeLacy families. Now, if you're not familiar, the plot of Frankenstein follows Victor Frankenstein, who's a scientist who creates a sapient creature. And this is important too, because there's almost another consensus misinterpretation of Frankenstein, which is that Frankenstein is a monster. But if you read the book, it's not a monster. I think that's like the popular image people have in their head because of something like the Munsters or whatever. But and like I was saying, even with the metaphor, you've created a monster like Frankenstein and it's loose. But if you read the book, the creature is assembled from human body parts, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's a monster in any way. It's a human being, albeit a fantastical one. It's not, it's assembled of human body parts, and it's obviously it's not something that's humanly possible to assemble a living thing with different human parts. So suspension of disbelief. But it is nevertheless, it's technically an actual human being because it's made of their organs. It's a deformed human, but it's not a monster. And it's even, like in the description of it initially, it's even given human qualities like having pearly white teeth and lustrous black hair. But then like the monstrous qualities are the sunken skull complexion and the sickly yellow skin. But nevertheless, it's a human being that its creator, Dr. Frankenstein, refuses to address as such. And the creature is, I think that if you read into it, the creature, in the way that it's deprived of its health and its exaggerated visage, it's analogous to the working class, like the treatment of working class in Shelley's day, who endured horrific working conditions and hours. And so Dr. Frankenstein is horrified by its appearance, and abandons it. And the creature, retreats into the hovel and comes to learn about the world, and is ultimately rejected by all those it encounters. And then it starts to seek revenge on Dr. Frankenstein by killing his loved ones. And then Victor Frankenstein spends the rest of his days trying to hunt and kill the creature, and it just creates this cycle of mutual destruction. Well, and also the book also shifts its first person perspectives. There's parts that are from the creature's perspective, there's parts that are from Dr. Frankenstein. And it's basically, when it retreats to the hovel and is observing the different families. It's basically like a feral child, a blank slate, learning about the human race and human social relations. So the reader, the spectator, is occupying that position. That this is the parts where it's the first person of the creature. And so it after it's abandoned, it's living in the hovel and it's spying on Frankenstein's family and also the DeLacy family, who are this exiled French family that used to have money, but they don't anymore. They've lost their fortune, they're no longer wealthy, and they're impoverished. And yeah, what you were saying about the critique of the traditional family, it's definitely a critique of that because the creature observes the social organization of the two differing families. Dr. Frankenstein is aristocratic, and you're reading this through the firsthand account of the creature, which is clearly deliberate on Shelley's part. And there's differing social organization between the two families. The DeLacy family is relatively egalitarian, despite their poor living conditions, and so this is clearly meant to say that the structure of the two families is socially constructed, and it's not innate. They're relative to their economic position. And I think the reader is meant to learn and observe this just like the creature living in the hovel. And the creature basically learns that poverty is what's determining the life of the Lacey family. And so Shelley is shining a mirror directly back into the reader's eyes through the text. And like I said, these passages, the narrative switches in perspective from Dr. Frankenstein to the creature, and the creature becomes aware of its own social position as an outsider, through its education of observing the two families. And he eventually approaches the DeLacy family, and they're also horrified by his appearance and reject him. But the creature observes and experiences social inequality itself based on, people react to his countenance, and he's treated with prejudice and rejection and becomes alienated. And so it's mirroring real world social issues faced by social classes, the discrimination that they faced, and also racial minorities and any other marginalized groups, people with disabilities or whatever. And the creature learns that he's judged solely on his physical appearance, his form, than his actual character. So the novel is almost heavy-handed in how it critiques a society that places a great deal of value on wealth and appearance. And it's, the creature has an underprivileged social standing, and he's rendered an outcast. Whereas, Dr. Frankenstein, he's in a position of wealth. He doesn't have to struggle to meet his material needs. And, he's afforded an education where he's able to be a scientist, engaging in this kind of endeavor. And as far as the feminist angle, I mean, yeah, it's noteworthy that the women in the family, Dr. Frankenstein's family, are excluded of this. It definitely makes a commentary about the gender hierarchy of nobility and feudal families having carried over into capitalism of the late 18th century, as represented by the Frankenstein family. And Dr. Frankenstein, his pursuit in the making of this creature goes awry, and he refuses to take responsibility for it. And this ostracized creature just seeks revenge by committing murder. So I think Mary Shelley is definitely trying to juxtapose Frankenstein's treatment of the creature with the treatment of lower classes, and the way that all these social ills are arising, such as violent crime coming from economic inequality. The ruling class refuses to address as a social problem. They're producing a monster, and like Dr. Frankenstein, they refuse any liability. So the creature isn't killing his family in a vacuum. It's because of the circumstances in which it's living. So there's an allegory about socioeconomic class, I believe it's present in the book. And the only critique you could make, I mean, the only problem I would say with the book, this is just me personally, is that it does seem to equate like scientific development itself, arguably, with this as like a logical outcome. It's sort of it doesn't identify necessarily capitalism itself as sort of the source of the it seems to inherently attach it to the advancement of science as opposed to, but that's just my reading of it.
Those are interesting observations you had about Frankenstein and what you were saying about the society that judges the creature by its appearance. I think a lot of the horror genre is sort of informed by the presence of the other, whether in a sympathetic portrayal or in a more reactionary portrayal. For example, like H.P. Lovecraft, who's a master of the horror genre, was
Mhm.
notoriously racist. And from reading his tales, one can see how sort of the fear of the other, the fear of the cultural melting pot created by immigration, and the rising of the subaltern races informs like his sort of themes that occur across his writings.
Yeah, I mean, it's even said that Lovecraft like used to go into ghettos and like observe the social decay, and that was like what directly inspired him for some of the stories he came up with. But I think that, there's something to be said also in regard to Frankenstein for the feminist interpretation as well, because, Dr. Frankenstein does view sexual and biological reproduction as something that's potentially unnecessary and removable. And in doing so, he's disrupting, the order of nature by trying to play God. And as far as what I was saying about Frankenstein, sort of, I mean, my criticism of it, it does seem like it's suggesting that this is like the possible end result of science's over rationalization. But, at the same time, it's like her fictional predictions in the period that she was writing can't be entirely dismissed. I mean, when you can take into consideration like the disturbing scientific experiments that took place like in Nazi Germany, or even the practices of like mental hospitals.
Unit 731 as well.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Reese
So it carries a lot of weight with it. I mean,
and
Dr.
Reese
Franken, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and I remember reading fairly recently about there's some scientific experiment of trying to make, because they've been experimenting with growing flesh in labs, make a human li body of living flesh to then conduct experiments on. Then you really have to get in the ethical questions. Well, if it's living body with living flesh, is it sentient? And it's a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what, so yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there's that narrative going on with Frankenstein. I definitely think, obviously, that it was making a it was a cautionary tale about those things, and to some extent, it even suggests that this is what's going to happen if we're blinded by scientific rationalization, that science has just become this dehumanizing force, and then it could ultimately lead to these kind of horrors. So, I mean, yeah, like Frankenstein was way ahead of its time in terms of predicting that. I just would emphasize that I think that the social critique aspect has been sort of downplayed as a narrative. So, yeah, that's my take on that. It's been a while since I read it, but that's what ultimately my thoughts were about it. And there's been various adaptations of Frankenstein, and like I said, there's a new one out that I have yet to see that Guillermo del Toro did as well. Yeah, I mean, I think there's various interpretations of it, but I think that one is sort of one out over the other when I think that there's a multitude of interpretations.
Yeah, I hadn't really heard that as much of that perspective on Frankenstein, and I think it's interesting. All right, let's talk about Stanley Kubrick's film, The Shining. First off, the film is different from the book, and in fact, Stephen King didn't like the movie. So there's been a lot of speculation as to what message Kubrick was intending to send, especially because he did make deviations from the plot of King's novel. In 2012, a documentary called Room 237 came out, which gathered together quite a few of the different interpretations of The Shining. My favorite, even though I think it's ridiculous, is the interpretation that The Shining is a confession by Kubrick about his filming of the Apollo 11 moon landing. This is sort of based on because Danny wears an Apollo 11 sweater in a scene in the film, and it's then they speculated that because the number of the haunted room, room 237, was changed from the novel's room 217 because Kubrick filmed the moon landing on soundstage 237 or something silly like that. In the documentary I mentioned, the peddler of the Kubrick moon landing conspiracy theory goes so far as to say that Kubrick was faking the making of Stephen King's book just because he really wanted to reveal what he underwent filming the moon landing and the sort of the suffering he had concealing such a monumental secret. Though another humorous reading of the film that actually particularly amuses me, being a writer, is that The Shining is a tale of an unsuccessful writer being driven mad by one hell of a case of writer's block. So I just want to play this one clip from the movie, which shows how skillfully Kubrick towed the line between horror and black comedy, with Jack Nicholson's brilliant performance. Let me just pull this up really quickly. Here we go.
Hi, hon. How's it going?
Fine.
Get a lot written today?
Yes.
Hey, the weather forecast said it's gonna snow tonight.
What do you want me to do about it?
Oh, come on, hon. Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand. I'll come back later on with a couple of sandwiches for you, and maybe you'll let me read something then.
Wendy, let me explain something to you. Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah?
Fine. And we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing. Whether you don't hear me typing, whether the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. Now, do you think you can handle that?
Yeah.
Fine. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here?
Later in the movie, it's revealed that all he's been diligently writing is the same sentence over and over with different paragraph spacing. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, there's also there's so many different layers to the film. I mean the Stephen King novel, I mean, seems to be more emphasize more that it's the story of a failed writer, or even, a, a, an alcoholic writer. I mean, also that he's sort of someone that, I mean, Jameson's essay talks about this, that I'm going to talk about, Fredric Jameson, the cultural critic and Marxist theoretician who wrote a very important essay about The Shining. Um, the King novel emphasizes more the fact that he is trying to be this writer, in the vein of Ernest Hemingway or William Faulkner, these figures that are so associated with like the tortured artist that's has a drinking problem that's trying to be a writer. But because of Jack's social standing, he can't really actually get there, and also that the film, its meta narrative, is making a commentary about the impossibility of cultural representation in the postmodern age. I mean, specifically, I don't know if, I mean, you mentioned Room 237. I don't know if Fredric Jameson was the first person to come up with the Native American burial ground theory that gets touched on in that film, but that's one of the primary interpretations of the film, that The Shining is actually, the Overlook Hotel and Jack are actually haunted by history. That it's not an occult film, or that it's not a supernatural horror film, really, that it's more of it's really a ghost story. And like I said, I don't know if Fredric Jameson was the first person to come up with that theory, but that he's really, I'd say, at the academic level, was the first person to really expand upon that. And if you read his essay, it's very interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it builds on a lot of the concepts he laid out in the work that he's most famous for, postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism. But his essay, Historicism and The Shining, focuses more on film. And he starts out by placing The Shining in film history as emblematic of one of his main concepts in his postmodernism essay and book, what is called pastiche. And he starts out by placing it amongst, like this constellation of other new Hollywood films, or 1970s American cinematic works. And pastiche, I mean, Jameson was a literary critic, but he also, one of the things I like about his work is that he sort of took the best of, I mean, we've been very critical of the Frankfurt School on this podcast, but they did have some worthwhile contributions. And I think Jameson took the most worthwhile aspects of the Frankfurt School and took it one step back towards a more materialist analysis. I mean, he's definitely part of Western Marxism, but I would say that he's one of the better, more worthwhile figures within that classification. But he was really cross-disciplinary in his work. You read a Jameson essay, one moment he's talking about Le Corbusier and architecture, and then he'll move to the historical novel and literature, Lukács, and then he'll shift to film, or and he's just very, in the same way that the Frankfurt School did. He frequently breaks down boundaries, and in a single paragraph will move from point A to point B with his circular writing style. And he's also very influenced by the post-structuralists as well, and took the best from their work as well, and sort of synthesized it. But he starts out placing The Shining in film history, as part of this recent movement of films. And like I was saying about pastiche, it's a literary category or artistic category, but it also applies to film, in terms of, pastiche is another way of saying, it's like a fancy way of saying copying, but really it's, he's drawing a contrast between, modernist works, which, from the late 19th century to the 1950s, they were modernist works were constantly trying to come up with new styles and movements and forms of artistic language. I mean, you had just even with something like visual art, you had impressionism, post-impressionism, cubism, Bauhaus, Dadaism, you had all these different, and then the apex was, abstract expressionism. And for Jameson, pastiche is related to this shift that took place, in historical periods or distinction in historical periods in modernism versus postmodernism, where modernism produced works that had real depth and were constantly searching for new visual and literary language. Like I was saying, in the case of modern art, just look at all the different artistic movements and changes that happened. There was a gradual departure away from realism towards abstraction, and it was taken as far as it could go with something like abstract expressionism. And the fact that what followed from abstract expressionism, was pop art, sort of really illustrates that break. I mean, in order to even read Jameson's Shining essay, you have to kind of understand his basic ideas about postmodernism. And, I think that the easiest to understand is the visual art demonstration, where he contrasted like the Van Gogh's painting of shoes with the screen prints by Andy Warhol of shoes, and where he demonstrates this contrast. I think a lot of people misinterpret it as like a value judgment, and it's not that Jameson was making this like sweeping indictment of Warhol or postmodern art. He was simply describing how, if you look at the two works of shoes by Van Gogh and Warhol, they are qualitatively different in that, Van Gogh shoes have, the picture tells a story, it has a deep meaning, and it's all about the individual artist's expression and like deep emotion. Whereas Warhol, there's this what he called waning of affect, where it's just a surface level screen print of these mass produced objects, consumer goods. And by waning of affect, he meant like a loss of emotion in this postmodern cultural representation. It wasn't a personal expression like in the case of the Van Gogh shoes. And it's not to say that there wasn't emotion in postmodern art, and obviously somebody like Warhol like took that to the nth degree. I mean, obviously in postmodern art there's emotion, but it's a more discursive or playful form of emotion. And there's a certain loss of self-expression in something like Warhol, especially. And emotion in postmodern art, it was more free-floating and discursive. And I think my point is that in order to read Jameson's historicism in The Shining, you kind of have to be familiar with his basic concepts about this shift in what he called the cultural logic of late capitalism.
Yeah, I just want to interject that I think one can't really understand the different shifts that have occurred in art and sort of representation without understanding that how they're connected artistic production is to the dominant mode of production at the time and what shifts it takes. You mean look at the shift in art with the rise of more financialized and digitalized capitalism.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's accurate. I think a lot of people read Jameson and they just think that he's making this inherent dismissal of like all art after 1950 or something, and that's not at all the case. He's simply being descriptive that, modernism emerged as a reaction to huge economic changes like industrialization, and these artists were in literature and in visual art, they were rejecting old styles, forms and conventions, and they were searching for deeper meaning. And so there's a level of depth in those works. And in the case of postmodernism, in contrast, he saw artistic works, including film, and this is where people misinterpret it because they think it's just a value judgment. Because he described that they took on a certain superficiality, like with the case of Warhol, the images was very flat, it's very surface level appearance rather than underlying substance. And he talked about this proliferation in pastiche or genre play where there aren't new genres being invented. It's that filmmakers or artists started working within pre-established genres, and it's what he actually called the cannibalization of all styles of the past. Because modernism, there was so much emphasis on originality and emphasis on authenticity and these works of individual genius. That's what was associated with modernism. With postmodernism, everything is styles of the past being remixed and imitated. And it's not that it's an indictment of the artist, it's that cultural production has reached a point where it has nowhere else to turn but the past.
Well, I would say it's because of the shift. Capitalism at one point was a progressive economic system, like in compared to feudalism, and now it is a dying economic system that is really historically no longer viable, and it's like the Gramsci quote that in the interregnum, morbid symptoms appear.
Yeah, and it Jameson made the same observations about fashion and also architecture. I mean, just look at postmodern architecture. It's a similar thing. It's a remixing of past styles. Everything is fashion is the apotheosis of pastiche. Everything is just this circular recycling of the past. So again, it's not necessarily a value judgment so much as a description of the historical moment and cultural logic determined by capitalism. And he gets into this with a film like The Shining, which because he also in postmodernism talked about there being a crisis of historicity. And by that he meant that this idea of grand narratives or universal truth in the postmodern age came to be seen as obsolete and inapplicable, and that there was an inability to see or to grasp the social totality. And there's now this sense of relativism that there's no sacred historical narrative. Instead, there's no single belief in a single objective truth. Now history is viewed as a series of disjointed or disconnected images or simulacra of the past with no intrinsic value or meaning. And Jameson saw this predicament as a key feature of postmodern works, including film, where historical styles were copied and pastiched and filmmakers would work within them. I mean, Blade Runner is another great example of this because it's a science fiction film, but it's also a noir film. It's a remixing of those genres. And in the case of The Shining, it's really omnipresent in the meta narrative because the film takes on this nostalgia for the 1920s where class consciousness, this was a time where class consciousness was more clearly rendered. And, he points out that for the characters in the film, the 1920s, it can only be represented through style and not direct, authentic experience. That's what made The Shining a thoroughly postmodern work. There's a growing dissociation or gap between the understanding of history and one's lived experience in the present moment in these works, which are products of late capitalism. So he starts out, situating the film historically with this change that's happening in filmmaking. And he also, he does observe like a lot of the unique cinematic techniques that Kubrick employed in his films. Like, for example, the way that he compares 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Shining, as far as like how the characters seem incredibly bored and are emotionally detached, and throughout the film have these very mundane conversations. I mean, in 2001, it's not the opening with the apes, obviously, but with the human characters, the second act. In the beginning of in the that part of the film, there's these series of scenes where these characters are just on this outpost on the moon, and they're just lifeless and living in this sterile, futuristic corporate environment. And in that film, it ends up demonstrating sort of the contrast with the HAL 9000 artificial intelligence character, who actually ends up coming across more human than the human characters in that film. But in The Shining, the same sort of techniques are used because, the film opens with Jack going to be interviewed as to be the new character at the hotel, and the hotel manager has the same depthlessness, as Jameson puts it, as those characters in 2001. And this is clearly on purpose, where like the actor, the tone that which he's speaking in, the dialogue, it's the same as those characters in 2001. And these, Kubrick was known for employing these very distinctive cinematic techniques, like including like one of them is known as the Kubrick stare, where there would be these scenes where the some of the characters, like in the case of The Shining, it's Jack, where he's clearly his character starting to lose his mind. There are these shots of him where he's at the table and he's not looking at the camera, he's not breaking the fourth wall, but he's like practically staring up through his forehead. He's staring off into space and he's losing his mind. But that motif is throughout Kubrick's films. It's in Full Metal Jacket, Private Pile does it. It's in A Clockwork Orange several times with the Alex character. And so, there's a unique filmic language that Kubrick employs that's distinctively his. So dialectically speaking, I mean, Jameson is recognizing that there is a certain sense of modernism to Kubrick's films, because he does have a unique individual artistic expression. It's not completely postmodern. But anyway, in addition to the meticulous composition and whatnot, I also think the tone of his dialogue in his films, particularly The Shining and 2001, the tone of the dialogue in which it's spoken like these characters, like the hotel manager, it's clearly on purpose. His tone, is so mundane in that opening scene, and then all of a sudden he starts telling Jack about how the previous caretaker went insane and killed his family, and it's like this chilling contrast for the spectator and the audience, because he's just having this very humdrum conversation, and all of a sudden he starts talking about this very grim, grisly murder that occurred. And so Jameson makes these observations about Kubrick's film techniques. And then in the latter half of the essay, he goes on to summarize how The Shining is not an occult film or a supernatural one like Rosemary's Baby or something like that. It's specifically a ghost story. It's pastiche in that it's recycling the ghost story, and
I really
name,
like I
namely
really
that the Shining, it's never really explained what it is. It's never really explained why Halloran and Danny have this telepathic abilities. But either way, Jack is not possessed by a supernatural entity. Rather, he's haunted by the historical past, namely the suppressed historical and class relations of American history within the Overlook Hotel. And so the Room 237 film gets into much more like detail as far as like the placement of objects, the Native American rugs, the river of blood that comes out of the elevator,
Also, the
symbolizing
voices,
genocide.
the voices at the beginning, the opening scene, there's sort of, you can hear like these twittering voices as well.
Yeah, and in the film score, I think it's the composer's name is Gheorghi Ligeti, if I'm saying his name. But yeah, like these big vocal chilling choruses in the background, and the ominous music at the beginning too when they're driving there. But Jameson sums it up. I mean, this is a great quote. The Jack Nicholson of The Shining is possessed neither by evil as such, nor by the devil or some analogous occult force, but rather simply by history, capitalized, by the American past as it has left its sedimented traces in the corridors and dismembered suites of this monumental rabbit warren, which oddly projects its empty formal afterimage in the maze outside. Significantly, the maze is Kubrick's own addition. Yet at this level, the genre does not yet transmit a coherent ideological message, or as Stephen King's mediocre original testifies, Kubrick's adaptation indeed transforms this vague and global domination by all the random voices of American history into a specific and articulated historical commentary. So I think that his essay is really worth reading because it talks about how The Shining for Jameson is a postmodern work through and through, and how it takes on this meta narrative where the whole film is like this, not just haunted by the past, but the characters themselves, Jack, are almost longing for the past, and the fact that there's the ending where he sees the photograph where he's there at the ballroom in the 1920s. He's always been the caretaker here, but yet there's this disconnect or this gap with the past, and at the same time, that's the antagonist of the film, that it's um, that Jack is haunted by the past, or the whole the it's a very nebulous force. I mean, it's never really explained what the Shining is. It's not anything tangential, or physical. It's the Jack has these visions, and um, we don't know what's really happening, what's not. But it's at the same time, it's not really a supernatural evil. It's so yeah, it's a very interesting essay, and it's a very important Marxist film essay, I think.
Yeah, I think Jameson's essay was good, and his interpretation of the film as Jack being possessed by history. I just assumed the first time I watched it, I hadn't read the essay, and I caught on to that it seemed like sort of this theme of the revenge of the past. And I liked the way Jameson characterized The Shining as a ghost story because, in a sense, ghost stories are almost always about events and people of the past returning to haunt the living, meaning the present. So just to recap, because we need to get wrapping up, there is also this sort of subtext of mass atrocity to The Shining because
Mhm.
where with the extermination of the Native Americans. It's mentioned in the film that the Overlook Hotel was built on a Native American burial ground, and the interior decor of the hotel itself features Native American art patterns. There are portraits of Native Americans on the wall. Then, of course, Danny repeatedly sees tides of blood pouring from the elevator, and it's easy to see that how the film can be interpreted as a violent revenge of the past, like a symbolic reenactment of past atrocities, where Jack stands in for the genocide era with Wendy and Danny as his victims. Although in the Room 237 documentary, this film historian Geoffrey Cox claims that The Shining is about a different mass atrocity, namely the Holocaust, because he points out that there were eagles placed throughout the film, and Jack has a German-made typewriter. But I think that the general history or possession or the more specific Native American genocide is more accurate. But just
Well,
one last thing before we finish. There is this one scene in The Shining that is sort of random and it's kind of a mystery where let me share the screen where there is this Wendy is running around and she sees in a room this man in a bear mask, it seemingly giving fellatio to the other guy. But I was reading about it that some people have interpreted because it's sort of a mystery. Who is the man in the bear costume? Why is he there and whatnot? It's been interpreted that it means that it's pointing out that Jack was sexually abusing Danny because if you notice, there's a scene before they moved to the hotel in Danny's house. He's laying on the bed. He had just had a vision, and there's like a psychiatrist seeing him, and there's a bear next to his head. There's just sort of ominous presence of bears in the room, and sort of the bear stands in for Jack, and then and I've heard I found a video where the person interpreted the Apollo 11 sweater that Danny is wearing instead of it being, reference to the fact that Kubrick faked the moon landing or whatever. It's symbolic of the phallus and that Jack forces Danny to give him oral sex. Um, yeah.
well, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's definitely like, I mean, the child abuse. I mean, in the opening of the film, he's also talking about how he forcefully, when Wendy is interviewed, she tells a story about how Jack forcefully grabbed Danny's arm and broke it. So yeah, there's definitely, I mean, there's the alcoholism aspect, there's the abuse of his family, um, but also, there's also the uh, subtext in relation to the Halloran character because he's sort of like this stereotype of like the magical Negro, and also the way that Jack's character, like erupts in racism, in one particular scene where he's in the bathroom with the butler talking about, the N-word cook. And then also the fact that when he's one of the scenes where he's at the bar and he is seeing the bartender and he's um starts talking about white man's burden, Lloyd, white man's burden. So there's many different things going on with the film. I mean, with his alcoholism, his domestic abuse, and then his sort of uh colonial mindset, there's many different things going on in the film. Um, but I think that Jameson's essay is a great example of like a Marxist interpretation of a iconic horror film. And The other thing, I mean, in regard to the moon landing thing, I mean, there's a lot of people, I mean, yeah, like 2001, A Space Odyssey really fed into that because, again, like you almost can't even blame people because, like, when that film was released, the footage in 2001 A Space Odyssey is so spectacular and ahead of its time. I mean, it looks more like real footage of outer space than the photographs of the moon landing and the broadcast, So I think that speaks to how good of a filmmaker Stanley Kubrick was. But I mean, um, yeah, I mean, I think Danny having the sweater on, the Apollo 11 sweater, is him clearly mocking people and thumbing his nose at that whole conspiracy. I mean, there's some people that say that they hired Kubrick to like take the photos or whatever. I mean, it's just so, I don't know. I've gone down the moon landing rabbit hole. We've discussed it on the podcast before. Um, yeah, it's a topic for another time, but uh yeah, either way, this has been a fun discussion and a fun episode. I think Well, we could have talked all day about more. I wanted to get into the Salem witch trials too, but um, yeah, I think we have to wrap up. Again, remember to hit like and subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. If you're watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's at Captive Minds Pod. And you can also follow us on X at Captive Minds X. Shaenah, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, just two things. One, that it's very much a shame that Jameson died fairly recently. I can't remember when, because
Yeah,
I would have
last year.
loved I would have loved to seen what he would have written about the latest Paul Thomas Anderson film, One Battle After Another.
Yeah, which is also, yeah, based on a Thomas Pynchon novel. And uh, Thomas Pynchon was or is a very, I mean, Jameson did write about Pynchon, I mean, as being like a postmodern writer. But yeah, he would have had interesting things to say. And yeah, Jameson died last year, sadly. And his works on film are very much worth reading. He's got a book, Signatures of the Visible, that has all his essays. He's got a great essay on Dog Day Afternoon and uh, numerous other films. So yeah, we recommend his work here at Captive Minds. But
Happy
anyway,
Halloween,
happy Halloween.
everyone.
Thank you for tuning in and watching and listening. And we'll see you next time on another episode of Captive Minds.